the question was, I got my first capital call this week. What portion of capital calls are you seeing with your deal so far?
I have not been in, actually, that is not true. I've been in one capital call. So let's take a step back. Sometimes capital calls are for a really good reason. I've been in a number of capital calls on retail and office deals a long time ago that, oh, we just got this big tenant unexpectedly. And I'm in an example, I'm in a deal in Canada that is all 100% government tenant, 100% medical government. It's all socialized medicine. And they keep adding on to the building. And we keep having to put, I'm talking every couple of years, I get a capital call because they're expanding for the government long-term lease. You're like, oh, that's money I want to put into this. That's a good capital call, right? So those do exist. I've had one capital call recently in an assisted living facility for a whole bunch of operational challenges there, unrelated to like end of cycle timing, floating rate loans, all kinds of stuff. We're having some operational challenges in it. So I don't really have any. I unfortunately, I'm not really exposed. I'm not in any of these floating rate loans. I'm not exposed to any of the stuff that's going on right now. So I'm not a good person to give feedback. But do yourself a favor with a capital call right now. If you're dealing with this and it's a type of capital call that has to do with a floating rate loan and extending a loan or a cash in refi or whatever it is, take a very close look at the projections you're being handed to substantiate you putting money in. And what I mean by that is there are very few sponsors who will project a recession in the next year or two and who will project reduced revenues, increase vacancies in the next year or two. Now, so you may not believe that's going to happen, and that's fine. You may agree with their projections 100%, but make sure you are digging into the details of those projections because you're about to put more money in based on those projections. And if they're not reasonable projections and you don't agree with them, ask the sponsor to either do a sensitivity analysis for you based on your own assumptions or just run some numbers yourself. Because there are plenty of capital calls where it does not make sense for you to put the money in necessarily. And there are plenty that does make sense. But make sure you've analyzed it thoroughly with your own agreement of the assumptions, possibly going into a recession that may not be accounted for in the projections. I'm going to assume the base case is that most of those projections will not actually account for a recession. No one's talking about recession. I don't know why, but no one's talking about it. And it's high probability of coming up. So
thanks, Jeremy. And I will leave off also with the capital call. This is something that actually came up at the conference that we were in. Take a look now. I think in 2018, people were signing off on these PPMs. That time has changed dramatically, especially on longer holds. Make sure you look at the language surrounding the capital call. I've seen some very barbaric language with a thing where your original principal is at loss. Realistically speaking, it's commonplace that if you don't do a capital call, you're diluted, but you shouldn't be risking your original principal if you're not willing to put in more of the capital. So just be very careful with the language surrounding capital calls, because I've seen ones where they said, if we do a capital call and in 10 days you don't, then your original principal is basically at risk. So just be very careful with the language surrounding the capital calls in these investments you do. And you always have to read that operating agreement.
Yeah, I could not agree with Dennis more. I'm really glad you mentioned that because I've actually been hearing a couple of stories as well. And the most important thing, of course, is to look at the operating agreement and the capital call provisions before you invest in a deal. I just looked at if I mention what it is, people will know what it is. So I looked at a deal recently and I really want to invest in it, even at this timing. But the capital call provisions, there's no flexibility for the person to change them. And they were way too onerous. And I've been waiting for years to invest with this person. I was like, I just can't do it because there's just too much risk. But yeah, look at the projections and look at the capital call terms so you can understand if you don't put it in, what happens to you. And it's funny because when I gave that answer before, I just assumed it was reasonable terms. So it's a good point. You need to check the terms.